I work for TEPCO located in Baytown, Texas, and today we're going to talk about using Oracle's Primavera risk analysis to perform a risk analysis on a P6 turnaround project. However, the risk analysis tool can be used for all types of projects, so many of the same concepts will apply. During this session, I'm going to talk about schedule prerequisites. I'm also going to talk about the Primavera risk analysis concepts, risk analysis reports, and then I will also take you into the risk analysis tool and show you how to run a risk assessment against a turnaround project file. A high quality schedule is required to run Primavera risk analysis. So you'll want to review your P6 schedule log to ensure schedule quality. There's also third-party tools like Acumen Fuse that work very well for this. Ensure you have a well-defined critical and subcritical paths. Your critical paths define the finish of a turnaround project, and the finish of the turnaround project is primarily what we'll be looking at when we run the risk analysis. Also ensure there are no open-ended activities. Everything should be tied off and flowing through to the turnaround finish milestone. Don't use too many constraints. Ensure all constraints are justified. Constraints bind up the schedule. Don't allow it to flex or breathe like it should. Constraints should always have some sort of justification behind them. Typically your start milestone and your finish milestone would have constraints on it. Minimal use of relationship lag, and this should also be justified. Relationship lag increases the duration of a particular sequence of activities, and it reduces the float. So if the lag is invalid, you want to make sure that's removed. Do not insert contingency activities at this time. The reason we're going to run Primavera risk analysis is to define what kind of contingency we may need, at least from a duration standpoint. Ensure accurate duration estimates. Don't insert fat into the estimates. Fat is not contingency. Contingency is something that you can identify in a schedule. Fat is hidden, so you don't want to increase your durations or your man hours on those activities just to kind of hide contingency in there. It should be very apparent where your contingency is if you have any. And as mentioned previously, we do not want any contingency in at this point. If you have long duration activities, break them into more detail. The longer the duration, the more effect it can have in the Primavera risk analysis when it goes through and does the analysis and reduces and increases the durations. It's a much bigger impact on longer duration activities. No negative float. Negative float implies that you're already behind schedule. Primavera risk analysis is typically performed before you execute. You should not have any negative float in the schedule. High float activities should be looked at. There could be exceptions, but you don't want your activities running with too high a float. You may be leveling your plan, which would reduce the remaining float on them. Check out your high float activities and just make sure they're valid. Majority of the relationship should be finish to start. Of course, there's exceptions, start to start, finish to finish, etc. Typical sequencing is a finish to start. And then identify the minimum, most likely, and maximum duration percentages. This is what we're going to talk about when we get into Primavera risk analysis. During a duration risk analysis exercise, Primavera risk analysis shakes up or rolls the dice against activity durations. It takes an activity duration and based on minimum, most likely, and maximum duration parameters that we set, it shakes up all the activities in the schedule 1,000 times over, and then it takes a snapshot each time that it does that, and it eventually stores that into a report for us at the end. The report then identifies the probability or the P number. So if you've ever had someone ask you, what is the P80 number or what is the P70 number, that's what it's supposed to provide us with. Those numbers define the probability of completing a project or a turnaround by a specific date or time. This can also be done against cost, although for this exercise we're going to focus primarily on duration. So as mentioned, the P number stands for probability. For example, let's say your schedule shows a tar finish completing on September 7th. So this would be the early finish inside your P6 schedule. Once Primavera risk analysis completes its process, it may show that the probability of finishing on September 7th is around 50%. But it also determines that there is an 80% probability of completion by September 13th. So the 80% probability would be considered a P number. If your management team asks you for a P80 date, you can tell them September 13th, and if they agree to that as their committed target, then you can impose contingency between September 7th and September 13th in the P6 schedule. You could insert this contingency as an activity, but it's also recommended that maybe you just use a constraint on your finish milestone. Move that finish milestone out to September 13th, which will impose extra total float. Let's talk a little more about minimum, most likely, and maximum durations. Typically, when we enter durations in P6, we enter the most likely duration. This duration is typically determined based on experience or historic data. So if we have a valve that we need to remove, and we've done quite a few of those valves before, and they always seem to take about 6 hours, we typically put 6 hours into P6 for the removal of that valve. Although we try to define it as accurate as possible, there may be a chance the duration will be shorter or longer. For example, here's a 10-hour activity. It's possible they could do it in 9 hours, but it's also possible that it could go as long as 13. Our most likely duration is 10. They might get it done in 9, and the maximum they think it could take is 13. If we convert this concept into percentages, they would be 90, which would be the minimum, 100, which is the most likely, and 130, which is the maximum. For this session, we're going to focus on what's called a duration quick risk. It allows us to identify the minimum, most likely, and maximum percentages, and we can apply those percentages across the entire project plan. So we don't have to go down one by one and enter these minimum, most likely, and maximum durations for each activity. We can apply the percentages as a whole, and Primavera risk analysis will calculate the minimum, most likely, and maximum durations for us for each activity. Once they're applied, we can override them. If we had set the numbers to 80 as a minimum, 100 as most likely, and 130 as maximum on all the activities, but we find that we have a vessel that hasn't been opened in 10 years and we don't know what the condition of the vessel is inside, we could actually change this or override this specific piece of equipment or job plan, and we could set the percentages to something like 95, 115, and 150. Which are more pessimistic settings. It'll cause the durations on the vessel to increase higher than they would on the other activities during the process. You can also tell Primavera risk analysis to ignore certain activities, so there actually is a checkbox in there that allows you to turn specific activities or entire job plans off and tell Primavera risk analysis don't even run risk analysis against these jobs or these activities. Regarding Primavera risk analysis report outputs, the two most common reports are a risk assessment histogram and a tornado diagram. Here's examples of both. The risk assessment histogram displays a deterministic date, which is typically aligned with the P6 finish date. Then it defines the probability date, P70, P80, P90. You can look at P10, P20, whatever date that you want to look at. The probability dates tell us by percentage when the turnaround may finish based on the risk analysis. And then the tornado diagrams, there's different types of tornado diagrams that you can look at, but the one we'll focus on is the schedule sensitivity tornado diagram. And it's used basically as a sanity check against the critical and near critical activities in P6. When we look at this report, we want to make sure that it kind of aligns with how our critical paths are in P6. And if we find something appear in this report that doesn't make sense, it's possible that the risk analysis, because of the parameters that we put against that specific activity or job, has caused that particular duration to increase at a much higher level, which has basically turned it into more of a critical path. You could actually identify something as critical in Primavera risk analysis that you did not see as critical in P6. So you want to do a sanity check against that. If the risk analysis is accurate, then you may need to go back to P6 and make sure that you monitor or somehow flag that particular activity or job as a possible critical driver. I mentioned already that this session is really just dedicated to duration risk assessments. However, I want to make you aware of some other functionality in Primavera risk analysis that you may want to consider. It does have a weather modeling tool in it. It also has a risk matrix, and the risk matrix is customizable. The one in the example here is a 5x5, but you can increase that to say an 8x8, whatever your organization requires. There's a risk register that you can build out, and then there's activity correlation. You can also do cost probability. So when durations decrease or increase, there's cost associated with that. Primavera risk analysis will automatically determine what the increase or decrease in cost can be based on the duration risk analysis, assuming that you have cost loaded your P6 data. If you are cost loading your schedules, you can bring those XCR files into Primavera risk analysis, and you could run some cost probability reports as well. Regarding activity correlation, you can take multiple activities and correlate them to each other. So for example, Let's say that we are going to remove a piece of equipment and then we're going to reinstall that piece of equipment. The duration of the removal can have an impact as to the duration of the reinstall. In other words, if you find during the execution that removing that piece of equipment takes longer than you planned, then it's assumed that the install will take longer than planned as well. Primavera risk analysis gives you the ability to correlate activities to each other. That way, if it increases the duration on activity A and activity B is correlated to it, then the duration has to increase on activity B. If you didn't do that, then the risk analysis tool could increase the duration on activity A, but then reduce the duration on activity B, which would basically cancel each other out. So just be aware that you can correlate activities to each other depending on their relationships and the nature of the work. Before we go into Primavera risk analysis, I want to take you into P6 and show you some basic information on this turnaround project file. I am only going to run risk analysis against the turnaround execution phase. So this is actually a copy of the original turnaround file, and then I removed the pre-turnaround, the shutdown, the startup, and the post-turnaround phases. Typically, I would leave the shutdown and the startup phases in there and run the risk analysis including those. However, the pre-turnaround and post-turnaround phases are not important, and I don't want a delay in the pre-turnaround phase to affect the turnaround execution start window. The start is scheduled for April 11th, and the finish is scheduled for May 9th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So keep that date in mind because that's the one we're going to monitor when we go into Primavera risk analysis. Also, we have near 50,000 labor units. Budgeted cost is around 5.3 million. There are 3,087 activities in this project. If you've never used Primavera risk analysis before, I'm going to point out a few things that you'll want to know. On the left-hand side is what's called a sidebar. You can turn that on by hitting the View menu at the top. This can come in handy for new users. What it has is 4 buttons down towards the bottom here, and each time you click one of the buttons, this upper section changes. I'll go through each of them. And you start from the top and work your way down. So schedule validation, this is where we would import a file or open a P6 file. We would also do a schedule validation to validate the import log. And then we move on to the next one, which is to develop the risk model. This is where we would put in our duration percentages that we want to apply. And then the third button is to actually run the risk analysis. And then the fourth button is to review the results. So you can select which reports you want to see in this area. I've exported the P6 project in XER format, so now I need to import it into Primavera Risk Analysis. I do this by ensuring I select the Schedule Validation button here, and then up at the top here, there is an Open Primavera XER link, so go ahead and click that, and there's the file that I saved out on my C drive. During the import, it's going to ask me a few questions, and I need to make some decisions here. Primarily on this one, the planning unit. My planning units were primarily an hour when I built that turnaround file, but I'm going to go ahead and select quarter hour in case I had set anything to say a half an hour long. Usually I don't plan turnarounds to less than an hour, but just to be certain, I'm going to select quarter hour. And down here I select the checkbox that says organized by the project WBS structure. This ensures that it brings in the P6 project WBS into Primavera risk analysis. And I click OK. Now it's going to ask me about some import mappings. Usually I don't do much here. The minimum durations, if I define them in some user field in P6, I could bring those in and set them as my minimum durations. Same with the maximums. But I'm going to define that after I import the XCR file into Primavera Risk Analysis. So the most likely duration only needs to be set, and I'm going to set that or leave it as the default to remaining duration. Also down here, this is very important, Primavera P6 values have been entered in days or hours. If you're wanting to perform this against a project file that you have set up in days, then you make sure you'll select days here. Since this is a turnaround file, I'm going to select hours. And there's nothing to do inside the probabilistic tab. So we'll click OK. And now the file will start importing. Once the import is complete, it wants to save the Primavera risk analysis file. So a save as window will come up. The file type is called a plan file or a .plan, and I'm going to click save and save it to my C drive. I already had one with the same name on my C drive, so it's just asking me if I want to replace that one, and I will say yes. And the import process has completed. Now that I have a project opened in Primavera Risk Analysis, I want to point out a few other things. First off, if this is your first time in Primavera Risk Analysis, or maybe you've been in here before but haven't used it very much, there are a lot of toolbars up at the top. Be aware that this tool was originally built as a scheduling tool, not a risk tool. There are many buttons up here and drop-down menus that are related to scheduling, just like we would schedule in Primavera P6 or Microsoft Project. The most important menus that we're going to deal with are the plan menu, and this is only because we're going to change some plan options. But the risk menu is the one that is going to be our primary menu. So once you get comfortable with using Primavera Risk Analysis, a lot of these toolbars out here could be shut off. Once the import is complete, the next thing I need to do is edit my plan options. So I'm going to go up to the plan menu, and then I'm going to go down to plan options. The first tab we need to look at is the date tab. The date format has been changed in my installation here previously, but be aware that the date format here by default when you do a new installation is more of a European format. So I've reselected a date format. As I make these changes, if I want to continue to use them for all of the new plans that I import, I make sure I hit this checkbox down below here. I also set my time to 24-hour. That's how I like to look at it. It's your choice. Now I'm going to go over to the time tab. This one is very important. If you're doing a turnaround file, make sure you set this to display duration in hours. If you are doing a project file and you're planning in days, you could set this to days, but for this example, we're going to set it in hours. The other thing I need to identify is the hours per day. The hours per day for my turnaround file are 24, and it's working 7 days a week. That doesn't mean all the activities are set up on a 24-hour calendar, but I do have some activities that are set by 7 by 24. Once I set that, I do have to adjust the default start time because the default finish time has automatically calculated based on where this was originally set at 9 o'clock, and we all know that there is not a 3300. It only goes up to 24. For what I'm doing here, I need to set this to 0 or midnight, and it'll automatically calculate the finish time as 2400 based on my hours per day. For what we're doing today, I do not need to go into any of the other tabs. I just needed to adjust my date format and my time in the date tab, and then in the time tab I need to make sure that my display of durations is in hours, that my time periods was set to 24/7, and that my default start time was at midnight or 00. I'm going to talk about the view a little bit here of the Gantt chart that I'm displaying. On the left-hand side, we have the activity table, very similar to what you would see in P6. And in the middle here, we have the Gantt chart. Over on the right-hand side, we have the minimum duration, most likely, and maximum. Now, these columns are all customizable. And over here, I also have some cost information. On the left-hand side here, there are little dashes next to each activity or grouping band, and you can use these to collapse the bands. I'm actually going to collapse my first few WBS elements because they are milestones, and there's a lot of relationship links tied to those milestones, and it's kind of making my Gantt hard to look at. So I'm going to collapse this one, the second one, the third one, and the fourth one because of their milestones. Now you can see I have columns here. That's my next equipment type WBS, and then columns are listed underneath. So we're going to use this as we're doing the risk analysis, and you'll be able to actually visually see the durations decrease and increase as we move through it. The next part of the process is to develop the risk model. Using my buttons on the left-hand side, I'm going to click the Develop Risk Model button. We want to do a quick risk. I'm going to click the Quick Risk button. And this window has a few different options. I can apply it to all the tasks in the plan, which is what I'm going to initially do. You can apply it to filtered tasks, so you can filter in this tool just like you can filter in other scheduling tools like P6 and P3 in Microsoft Project. I can also tell it to only apply it to the selected tasks. I do select overwrite existing estimates and duration distribution notes. That ensures that if I want to overwrite some that already have numbers in them, it will ensure that it overwrites them. The distribution is triangle. I'm not going to go into detail about the different types of distributions in this session, but what we want to focus on is our minimum duration, likely or most likely duration, and our maximum duration. Currently, this is set for the minimum duration to be 80%. Our likely duration is 100%. So our likely duration, as you recall when importing, was set to the remaining duration. So our most likely duration in Primavera risk analysis is going to stay at 100%. It's not going to move. But the minimum, we'll go ahead and leave that at 80%, and the maximum, I'm actually going to bring that up to 130. What this is really saying is that we expect all the activities to occur within their remaining duration that's been defined, but there's a chance that they could actually get them done earlier and it would only be 80% of the duration. But there is also a risk that the durations could run over up to 130%. If this was a 10-hour activity, that means our most likely would be 10 hours. During the analysis, it could drop it during the iterations down to possibly 8 hours, but it could also increase it up to 13 hours. And I click OK. And you'll notice over here, these fields have now populated. The most likely was our remaining duration and still is. And you can see that Primavera Risk Analysis automatically calculated minimum durations and maximum durations based on the 80, 100, and 130 that we had entered for our quick risk. And it's done that for every activity all the way down in the schedule. Now that we've set the minimum, maximum, and most likely duration parameters for the entire project, I want to show you how to overwrite the parameters for a specific piece of equipment. I've scrolled down to where my vessels are, and I'm going to highlight all the activities inside of this vessel. And I do that by clicking up here on the left and then pressing shift click. And now I have highlighted the activities that I want to make the change to or overwrite. I'm going to hit the quick risk button over on the left again, and you'll notice when the window comes up that it now says selected tasks only. This does this automatically, but you will want to make sure that that is truly selected, and also ensure the checkbox for override existing estimates and duration distribution notes is also still selected. I'm going to change my minimum duration. I'm going to be more pessimistic on this particular vessel. I'm going to say the minimum could be 90. I'm going to change my most likely duration and bump that up to 110. Now this implies that I'm not really confident with the actual original durations that have been set in P6. And then just to be extreme on this one, I'm going to bump the maximum duration up to 180. Now when I click OK, watch what happens to the fields over here. And you'll see that they have all reset based on those new parameters that I entered. So that is how you can overwrite a specific job or edit a specific piece of equipment and change the parameters on it. With the parameters in place, I'm now ready to run my risk analysis. So down on the left, I'm going to select the Run Risk Analysis button. Up in the options here, I have Build Impacted Risk Plan, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to click the Run Risk Analysis button. Now when the risk analysis window appears, you can tell it how many iterations you want to run through. 1000 is the default. If you have a large project plan and the process takes a long time, you could cut that back down to 500, or if you want to be very detailed, you could bump that up to say 2000. But 1000 is going to be sufficient for what we're about to do here. I can watch it, so when I click Analyze, it's going to allow me to step through it or click the button over and over again 1000 times. I'm going to turn this on. I'm not committed to doing that because there is a button that I can press to just make it run. But I do want to show you probably the first 10 times what happens in the background while these iterations are going through. And then there's also an option to show a specific report at the end, and I want the distribution graph to automatically appear. So I'm going to click Analyze. We click Analyze, some warnings will come up. It's telling us the most likely value on this one. The most likely value is not the same as the remaining duration. It will also tell us other things like some schedule quality issues if they exist. And you can move through these warnings by hitting the next button. But if you're well aware of what you've changed and what the warnings are implying, you can just click OK to close this window. Now that I've closed the window, I have two different options here that I could use. I can hit the step button, which is going to perform the first iteration, or I could hit the complete button, which is going to automatically run all the iterations, and we can watch the progress as it's moving forward. For the first few, I'm going to hit the step button. While I'm doing this, watch what happens to the durations of this column down in the Gantt chart. You can see the durations have moved or shuffled. This is where Primavera risk analysis is rolling the dice or shaking up the durations. It's using the parameters that we set, and it's randomly just making a change to those durations within the parameters that we had set. If I hit it again, you'll see it happen some more. And you'll see it goes back and forth, randomly sets the durations to be more on the minimum side, or sometimes it'll set them to be more on the maximum side. So that should give you a general understanding of what it's going to do in the background. Now I've only done 13 so far, but I need to do 1,000. I obviously don't want to click the step button 1,000 times. I'm just going to hit complete and it will move forward on its own. And as it's moving forward, we are not going to see the Gantt chart refresh, but it is doing exactly what we did that first 13 times in the background. Before we ran the risk analysis, we had asked it to open up the distribution graph when it was complete, which is what it's done. By default, it selected the top level, the entire plan. That's not really what we want to look at. I want to find the turnaround finish milestone and look at that. There is a search menu right here, so I'm going to type in finish and hit enter, and now it's found all the activities or milestones that have the word finish in them. And this is the one I need right here, this turnaround finish milestone. Once that's selected, the histogram will update. Now I could go through and select any activity I want. So if there's a specific job and you want to know when a specific job is going to complete and do risk analysis on that one job alone, you could select the last activity in that job, or if you had a finish milestone on it, you could select that. Let's talk about what the distribution graph is showing us. On the bottom we have the dates, and on the right axis we have the percentages by date. On the left side we have the number of hits. So as it was rolling the dice on the activities, this is how many times that finish milestone landed on these dates and times. So you can see it landed mostly right here because that has the highest number of hits. If we were talking about a casino and rolling dice, if you've ever played craps, you know that rolling a 7 is probably the most common because there's so many combinations of 7 when you roll 2 dice. So same concept here. When it was rolling the dice on the activities, the finish milestone was landing mostly on this date and time. You do have some options down in the lower left here as to how the graph is going to appear, but all I really want to point out are these highlighters. You can turn certain highlighters on, which are actually the lines drawn up in the graph. We have one drawn for 50%, one drawn for 80%, and then there's one drawn for the deterministic. Now I mentioned the deterministic is actually the P6 date. There's some more information on that over here where it says the deterministic is set for May 9th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The analysis is telling us that there is only a 13% chance that we are going to actually achieve that date. Now keep in mind that that's based on the parameters of the 80, 100, and 130 that we had put into the schedule. So based on those parameters, it's saying that there is only a 13% chance that we are going to make the deterministic date. I'm typically more comfortable if the deterministic date is a bit closer to the 50% date. Now in this example, if I was being asked by management to identify the P80 date, which is the 80% date, I could tell them that the P80 date is May 11th at 3:30 in the afternoon. With that, I can go into P6 now and build my contingency and make it so that the turnaround is going to finish or is scheduled to finish on May 11th at 3:30 in the afternoon. Typically, I would go into P6 and take the finish milestone and constrain it to this P80 date. Once I reschedule P6, it's going to calculate more float than what I originally had with the deterministic date of May 9th at 3 o'clock. So this is basically saying if you are going to go with a P80 or probability of 80% for a date, that date is actually 2 days or almost 2 days later than my deterministic P6 date. So by moving the finish milestone constraint on the turnaround out to May 11th at 3:30, I'm imposing around 2 days or near 48 hours of float contingency. You can also click in the graph for different P numbers. So if I wanted a P70, I can click on the 70%, and over here it's going to give me the statistics on the P70, or if I wanted to do a P90, I could click there, and maybe that's the information that I need to provide to management. I'm going to go with the P80 date, and I'm going to click this button that says Add to Distribution Analyzer, and then I'm going to click Show Distribution Analyzer. This gives us another graph or another report. It's the same data in a different format, but this can be handy because if I rerun the analysis again, I can take the second analysis and apply it to the same graph, so I'm actually comparing both of the analyses. I'm going to close the distribution graph, and I'm going to go up to my toolbars, and there's one called the tornado, and I'm going to click this, and it's going to bring up what's called a tornado graph. This is the graph that I can use to do kind of a sense check against my P6 schedule. I do know that in my P6 schedule my F77 is my most critical, so this all makes sense, and I could scroll down these activities and see if anything else appears. I do know that F78 is also near critical, but as I get down further and it becomes less critical, I'm not going to be too concerned. The important part is to make sure that after the risk analysis is completed, that the sensitivity of the durations is analyzed and make sure that it matches or makes sense when compared to your P6 plan. There are some other tabs down here you can look at, and they all kind of display sort of similar data depending on how you want to look at things. There's also cost sensitivity, but if you click some of these and you didn't tell Primavera Risk Analysis to run this analysis while it was doing the actual risk analysis, then it has to run it right now, so it's actually calculating the cost sensitivity at this time. By not turning this on during the execution of the actual risk analysis, it'll save you some time, but then if you come over and start looking at things like the tornado graphs and you decide you do want to look at one of these reports, then you may have to take the time to let it run its process. And this is the cost sensitivity. I'm going to click OK to close this. I went back to the distribution graph just to point out a few other tabs that are down at the bottom that you can look at. There's start date distributions, there's duration distributions, float, but one that a lot of people seem to have some more interest in is the cost. So if your schedule is cost loaded, you could go and look at the cost distribution. Now keep in mind that I have a milestone selected here on the left hand side. I'm going to go up and look at the cost distribution for the entire plan. This will give me the cost distribution, so I could get P numbers based off of cost. I hope you found value in this presentation of using Primavera Risk Analysis to analyze a P6 turnaround file. If you'd like more information on TEPCO's services or their training schedule, please go to www.tepco.us.